WPWK with Dennis Coffey and the Detroit Guitar Band with Scorpio, which is a classic hip-hop break track. And Dennis Coffey also played in the band from Motown, so the Funk Brothers. So he was quite the guitarist in the funk scene as well in Detroit. This is Colleen with you on WPWK. And in the next hour, we'll be discussing the remaining two heritage loudspeakers, the Heresy and the Cornwall, and playing music from the late 1950s when those two loudspeakers were developed. I have Jim Hunter, the Klipsch historian, in the booth with me discussing these fantastic speakers, but a little bit of music first from good old Blue Eyes. Under my skin. You are listening to WPWK, Keepers of the Sound, here at CES. And in the booth with me right now, I have Jim Hunter, who is the official Klipsch historian. Hello, Jim.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And today we are going to discuss the remaining two loudspeakers we haven't yet spoken about in the heritage range, which is the Heresy and the Cornwall. So the year is 1957. And of course, Paul Klipsch already has a very successful corner horn called the Klipsch horn, but he wanted to branch out and create another speaker. Why is that?
Well, he was actually drawing dirty pictures on the backs of envelopes.
What a dirty man. Dirty
yes.
man.
And he had one of his reps with him, and his rep looked over his shoulder and noticed that it was not a corner horn. And he said, coming from you, Paul, that would be heresy. And Paul liked the idea. Mm-hmm. Now, Paul had been trying to develop a 3-channel stereo system, a derived center channel from 2 main channels.
So why wouldn't he just use a Klipsch horn in the middle?
Well, it was highly difficult to have a corner in the middle of your room.
You have to build the false corners.
Right. Mm-hmm. And also, the center channel really did not need full bandwidth. So he was able to really make a speaker that started at 100 hertz and went up very cleanly. Mm-hmm. And that really became his center channel. He used to say he likes to put a leg iron on the soloist, and that tends to do it. Mm-hmm. It also was very advantageous that he could put it in the back seat of his airplane. Oh,
of course, because getting a Klipsch horn into the back of an airplane isn't an easy job.
It's a challenge. And he was in the air all the time, going to all of his dealers all over the country.
I noticed that on the website. If you look at his log on the airplane log, that he'd be out for weeks sometimes.
He could be 20 places in a month.
My gosh. Tireless. With the Klipsch horns, how far would you put them? Why would you need a center channel? What would the length of the room need to be, or the width of the room need to be before you had to put a center channel in?
Well, many of his installations were, 25 feet wide, and there was certainly a hole in the middle. Mm-hmm. But when you move speakers probably more than 10 to 15 feet apart, you have the potential to have a hole in the middle.
Right. Yeah. So this loudspeaker would be able to kind of fill that hole.
Yes.
And were there any other reasons that he needed to do that, aside from just as a center? It was only as a center channel, not to be used on its own.
That was the initial reason. Mm-hmm. But it soon became apparent that people wanted this small speaker as a full-range speaker. And so very early in the development, he changed the crossover to give it a smooth, flat response as wide as it could go.
Mm-hmm. Now, another interesting thing I read about it is that you could either put it vertically or horizontally, the Heresy.
You probably could.
Right, yeah. I guess he was kind of thinking about cosmetics as well. It wasn't just about... He was kind of thinking about people's living rooms and their actual habits, thinking, for cosmetically, what would work.
Yeah, I have seen one horizontal Heresy installation. Mm-hmm. Everything else has been vertical.
Okay. And is there any other background you want to share with us before we get to some music?
I think you ought to turn on the music.
Okay, let's do this. This is Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong with They Can't Take That Away From Me on WPWK. WPWK with Tony Bennett, Stranger in Paradise. Ahead of that, John Coltrane, I'm Old Fashioned. And with me in the studio, we have Jim Hunter, the Klipsch historian, and we're discussing the second loudspeaker that Paul Klipsch designed, which is now known as the Heresy, but it didn't have that name when it was first built, did it?
No.
Oh, sorry. Let me put your mic up there.
No, it did not.
It didn't have that name.
It went for 7 years being referred to only as the H, the Model H. Now in Hope, Arkansas, at that time and still today, it's largely Southern Baptists. And a lot of them did not appreciate the humor in using the word heresy.
Okay.
So Model H stayed in the literature until 1964. At that time, Bob Moores decided that we're just going to come out of the closet and call it the Heresy.
So they couldn't think of any other name for it.
No, they had 2 different naming contests, and there were dozens and dozens of names suggested. All of them pretty comical by today's standards.
Do you remember any of them?
Not offhand.
Okay.
but it was pretty crazy.
Right. And so what eventually happened? How come he eventually said?
Bob just said, sorry, Southern Baptists, we're going to go with heresy. And he was a great marketer.
And so they actually used that to their advantage, didn't they, in their
yes.
advertising campaign in the 70s?
Yes, in another 10 years it was advertised as Heresy in the Church for the pro-type installations.
And did churches actually have the Heresy loudspeaker?
Oh, yes.
Wow. So
I've attended one that had heresies.
Really?
Dual heresies.
Dual heresies. Dual heresies in the church. I love it. Well, let's talk about the Cornwall coming up. That's the one he designed in 1959. So let's just stick with one of the biggest hits from 1957, which is from this man who we're celebrating his birthday today. It's Elvis Presley on WPWK. Gene Vincent with Bebop Balooba, and that's on WPWK. This is Colleen with you. I have Jim Hunter, the Klipsch historian, in the studio with me. And now we're going to discuss the third loudspeaker that Mr. Paul W. Klipsch designed shortly, just 2 short years after the Heresy. He was kind of on a roll, wasn't he?
He was indeed. He developed the Cornwall to do double duty, to both be a better center channel than the Heresy, as well as to be able to stand alone as a full bandwidth speaker. He debuted it at the 1959 New York Audio Fair, and it was flanked by Klipsch horns in a 3-channel array. It had a sign above it, and it said that it could be used either in a corner or along a wall, and it was not named any suggestions. Well, they got many suggestions. They took them all home, he and his wife, Belle. And they got home and they really didn't like any of the suggestions.
Right.
And finally, Belle said, we can use it in a corner, we can use it on a wall, we ought to just call it the Corn Wall. And that stuck.
Right. It's funny because it seems like he always had problems coming up with names. I mean, he didn't name the Klipsch horn, somebody else did. The Heresy, it took them 7 years to finally say, okay, that's what we're calling it.
And somebody else actually suggested it.
And someone else suggested it, and then at least Bell stepped up to the plate on this one.
Yes.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about on the Cornwall?
I don't believe so.
Okay. All right, well, let's listen to some Miles Davis, which was Kind of Blue, which came out in that year. One of my favorite songs, and many of you, it's a total jazz standard, so many of you may feel the same way. It's So What on WPWK. WPWK with Bobby Darin, Mac the Knife. Ahead of that, the great duo of Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong with Now You Has Jazz. This is Colleen with you, and in the studio I have Jim Hunter, who is the official Klipsch historian, and we're going to talk about the Cornwall, which is the third loudspeaker that Paul W. Klipsch designed. What was the design like for the Cornwall?
The Cornwall is a vented box design or a bass reflex. Today, an engineer would use teal small parameters to execute such a design. But in 1959, that design paradigm did not exist. And so Paul did it the old-fashioned way, excruciating trial and error. And he did much trial and error, and he was pretty successful. Many years later, a well-known engineer by the name of Don Keel measured the Cornwall, and it turned out to be within 4% of the lowest distortion teal small alignment. So, he did it the hard way.
Right.
And initially, Cosmetics of the Cornwall took their cue from an earlier speaker called the Shorthorn.
And what was the bass response again on the Cornwall?
It's down to about 32, 34.
Because we used it last night and at the event that we did at the John Varvatos store, and it sounded absolutely. It was amazing. I mean, I've fallen in love with the Cornwall, I think.
Yeah, and you didn't have enough power.
And, because, I'm a Klipsch horn fan. I was like, wow, I think I need a pair of these now. But there's a lot of, there's some famous people who really love the Cornwall themselves.
Yeah, very recently, Billy Bob Thornton and Robert Cray both insist on Cornwalls for their monitors.
Didn't one of them get in touch with you guys to do an advertising campaign?
I believe they have. Oh, but we have used Billy Bob.
Right, exactly. Well, why don't we listen to some Robert Cray? And this is a tribute to Stevie Ray Vaughan, the late Stevie Ray Vaughan, who is now being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, for which Klipsch is the official sponsor. You're listening to WPWK.